Hello, and welcome to another edition of Brussels Sprouts. I'm Andrea Kendall-Taylor.
I'm Jim Townsend.
And we're so glad you can join us. On the surface, great power competition often seems driven by economic and military conflict, but diplomacy has always been central to great powers' engagement with the world. This is the argument made by Dr. Wess Mitchell in his forthcoming book, Great Power Diplomacy: The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger. Covering 15 centuries of history, the book makes a powerful case that diplomacy is an essential tool of great power politics, and leaders ignore diplomatic skill at their own peril. From antiquity through the Cold War, the book tells the story of diplomacy's role in grand strategy through vignettes and key flashpoints, exploring how legendary empires have used diplomacy as a tool of grand strategy to outwit, outmaneuver, and outlast militarily superior opponents. And of course, with the press of current events, and especially the rise of cooperation across the Axis of Upheaval, the book is more relevant than ever. So we're therefore very delighted to welcome the book's author, Wess Mitchell, to Brussels Sprouts. Wess, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Andrea and Jim. It's a pleasure to be here.
A very brief intro. Wess is a scholar of international relations, a principal at the Marathon Initiative, and he served as the United States Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia from 2017 to 2019. And of course, as I said, he is the author of a new book, Great Power Diplomacy: The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger, which is out officially on Amazon on October 14th. So we hope every Brussels Sprouts listener is going to grab a copy. So Wess, let's set the stage. I'm going to just start, I think, in a really open-ended way. I've given a little teaser of what the book's about, but it would be wonderful to hear in your own words what the book is about, and especially why you felt it was needed.
So this is a book about how great powers, the strongest states in any international system, use diplomacy to survive and gain an advantage in competition with other great powers. When I say diplomacy, a lot of people, their eyes probably glaze over and they think of John Kerry arriving at Davos to give a speech on climate change, but that's not what I'm talking about. I mean old school diplomacy. The use of negotiations to advance the national interest in matters of war and peace, life and death. This kind of diplomacy, as I describe in the book, is as old as the human species. You find it in Homer and Thucydides and the Bible. It was a mainstay of history's most successful kingdoms and empires. But my starting point in the book is that classical diplomacy became something of a lost art in U.S. foreign policy in the years after the Cold War, because America was so powerful militarily that we came to believe we could remake the world in our image. I think we became over-reliant on military power and sanctions. You think of managing problems overseas from a U.S. perspective through remote-controlled high-tech munitions, or maybe applying the right dose of economic sanctions. So it's more these things have become more questions of operations than strategy. But I think beyond all of that, after the Cold War, my sense is that the United States, maybe the West broadly, embraced the idea of Immanuel Kant, the 19th century German philosopher, that the world is moving toward a golden age where there will be no more war. The nation state will be replaced by these multinational bodies. And in that scheme, the job of U.S. diplomacy was to build and operate this thing called order, global order with a capital O. So my argument is that Kant was wrong. There won't be a golden age. Geopolitics is a permanent part of the human condition. And diplomacy is not a thing above or apart from conflict and competition. It's an integral component of it. So the job of U.S. diplomacy is not to tend to order as an abstraction, but to fight for concrete advantages and benefits for the U.S. national interest. So that's what the book is about, and it uses history to explore the way that great powers in the past have used diplomacy as a tool of strategy. It's basically an attempt at rescuing diplomacy and bringing it back to its proper home, which I believe is grand strategy.
So I mean, obviously, you walk through lots of anecdotes in the book. You talk about kind of the Spartans and the Athenians, and I briefly read through a couple of the anecdotes that you discussed. There's the Spartans, and then you had Metternich. In a couple of places, it seemed to me as if part of the argument about diplomacy, at least in these past cases, was to buy time. I think in the case of the Spartans, you talk about their use of diplomacy and the king's kind of remit to go out and pursue a diplomatic path was to buy time that allowed them then to be better positioned for a coming war. And I think similarly with Metternich, you talked a little bit about the way that he used diplomacy to, as you said, I think, extend beyond the natural lifespan of that system. So is this, I mean, I guess the question is then, is diplomacy something that you feel is so essential now because we are stalling for time and trying to better prepare ourselves for what would be kind of an imminent conflict? Or are we trying to extend, if you believe that the United States' relative power is in decline, then it's diplomacy that's going to allow us to hang on to influence longer than we might otherwise, but we should generally accept that we're in relative decline.
Well, I think you're right to focus on the central component of time. It's an understudied aspect of strategy. And in working on this book, it quickly became apparent that the central thread that runs through the experiences of these earlier great powers in the use of diplomacy as an instrument of strategy is to manipulate the element of time, both with regards to when war occurs. So let's just call that sequencing, and the duration of conflict. So putting limits on when and how war occurs. This is the prime stuff of diplomacy. If you just had to sum up with one word, diplomacy's role in strategy, it really does come down to time. If I were to be more precise, I would say the temporal aspect of diplomacy is it's the instrument and the only instrument at the disposal of a state that allows it to concentrate, basically to rearrange power in space and time in a way that allows for concentration of effort. That's the key idea. That's the central idea of the book. Clausewitz called concentration the most important element in strategy. Concentration meaning the ability to get material, military, economic wherewithal, your own and those of your friends, in the key place at the key moment. Diplomacy is the tool that states use to attempt to achieve concentration at the key place at the key moment. So when you think about it in that way, yes, the United States today does need to be conducting strategic diplomacy in pursuit of this goal of the ability to concentrate the resources we have at the critical moment. That inherently implies trade-offs. And so diplomacy and strategy is both about achieving the concentration and managing the trade-offs that occur as a result.
Wes, it's great to see you here. And Andrea is giving me the great honor of actually asking an early question. So thank you, Andrea, for that. Because I don't want it to leak out of my ears because there's so many things I want to ask you. First of all, I'm really interested in your book also because my experience in really getting into the engine room of foreign and defense policy was after the Berlin Wall fell. And so my experience in the Pentagon working these things, the geopolitical things with Europe and working closely with the State Department and our diplomats and dealing with crises as they came. And you're right. So many times it was the military hammer. I had these same kind of questions too about our approach. So I'm really interested in reading your book. But my first question is this, and I'm going to put three of them kind of into one. Why is it, do you think, that the U.S. isn't real good at being the kind of diplomat you're describing? When I was at NATO, I really one of the many great things about working at NATO is it exposed you to how other allies do their statecraft. And I marveled at the table watching French and Germans and the Brits and others, small allies too, the Dutch and others, watching them do what you're talking about around the table. And I mean, it was in a smaller manner. We weren't dealing necessarily with a crisis, but I was the skill that they brought to the game seemed better than ours. They seemed to. It seemed. I mean, and then the people you talk about, whether it's Kissinger or Brzezinski, particularly, they came from a tradition totally different from us. And so my feeling is that what was it about Europeans, the typical European diplomat, that seemed to be really good, even in small ways, and what you're talking about that we need to do, and we just didn't seem to. We were a whole different character, which had its strengths too, but we didn't have the skills that they did, and so we more quickly turned to the military hammer because we were better at that than we were as that. And so, two little bits that are part of that question is, how do you describe in the American context a diplomat? Who is a diplomat? Is it someone that's in the foreign service, or can someone else be a diplomat? And so, what does that look like, and what does diplomacy look like in the American context? So when I think back to the people that you're referring to, I think of Brzezinski and I think of Kissinger, both of whom were academics. I think of Holbrooke, who was a foreign service officer, and he was a diplomat. But the tools that he used were different than that's. Well, I don't know. Maybe they were different from Metternich, but as I look at the U.S. history, every now and then, I mean, I could come up with five people that I would think would fit the bill, arguably, but not many. So my question is, why are we so bad at it, honestly? And I don't want to insult anybody listening to this, but I mean, why are we not as skilled as Europeans are? And but in the American context, who can be a diplomat? Who is it John Kerry, or is it who is a diplomat? What does our diplomacy actually look like, and why is it different from Europe? So, some easy questions for you.
No, those are great questions. So let me start by saying one insight that became clear to me as I was writing the book is that classical diplomacy is endemic to any setting where there is competition. So you see it emerge in competitive environments, first in the ancient Middle East, and then Greece, and then the European mainland. And when you think about it in that way, it helps understand why, as you've put it, the Europeans historically have been so good at diplomacy. It's because you had these little polities crammed cheek by jowl in this compressed area, rubbing up against one another. They could, in most cases, they couldn't simply overpower their neighbors by force. They couldn't go out and whip everybody on all of their borders. So at any given moment, all of them had to have the ability, even if they were militarily strong, to be able to use what Richelieu called the art of talking, to not be fighting everybody at once, right? And by the way, that is a red thread through my book. The shaping factor of multi-front war, the danger of two-front war. Over and over again in history, I was struck at how often the finest moments of diplomacy come about when a great power faces a vise, a pressure of two fronts. It needs to free up bandwidth from one front to focus on the other. Again, time doesn't want to do this forever, but long enough to deal with the imminent threat. So the Europeans have gobs of experience with that all the way back to the earliest days. In the US case, I mean, I would say we have been good at that kind of diplomacy. We can be good at it. I think of the founding fathers, who had a very special conception of a strategic conception of diplomacy. Teddy Roosevelt, Richard Nixon. But I think there have been a couple of things that often have worked against our country in the use of diplomacy. One of them is just the sui generis geography and set of ideals that have been behind the American project from the beginning, that there has been this temptation to almost transcend geopolitics and either turn everybody into a democracy, or you think of Wilson and the League of Nations, like to inject domestic conceptions of law into the international level. So that's been a hardy perennial in the American tradition of statecraft. But I think particularly after the Cold War, this exceptional moment where we were just so strong that technology and ideals seemed to be in the ascendancy to a degree that just didn't necessitate the kind of diplomacy I'm talking about. If you have a military that can realistically aspire to a 2.5 war standard. And you've just won the Cold War. Your ideas are in the ascendancy, and there's not a peer competitor in sight. It makes sense in a way that the US would be lured into what, in retrospect, was an overstretch of our power in many cases, but lured into the idea of a transformationalist foreign policy. I think, your question, who is a diplomat? I would say it's anybody who is a formal representative of the state empowered to negotiate with foreign powers. So there are a lot of people who work at the State Department. Probably a very small fraction of those you would properly call a diplomat. There are people who are not foreign service officers, but are senior officials in our government, all the way up to the president, who are diplomats in the same sense that Richard Nixon was a diplomat, or Bismarck, or Metternich. Steve Witkoff is a diplomat, even though he's not a member of the Foreign Service, because he's conducting the key thing of diplomacy, which is interactions and negotiations with foreign powers. The final thing I would say is that there is maybe an understudied genius to American diplomacy, or a special trait that we have that I think at key moments tends to make us really good at diplomacy, and that is our business culture. That we have a private sector that excels in things like negotiations and trade-offs that often, and by the way, also our congressional setting, the fact that policymaking in the United States is a lot of give and take. Compromise is the stuff of diplomacy. And so in the US ecosystem, our business community and Capitol Hill provide a lot of practical ability to negotiate. We don't often think about it in that way. But, in the book, when writing the American chapter, it quickly became apparent to me that in many ways, Nixon in many ways was a better negotiator than Kissinger. And why was that? It was because he had decades of experience both on Capitol Hill and in private sector. I personally think Donald Trump is a very good diplomat, precisely because he has experience in negotiations. So I think the U.S. Does have a different experience than Europe in our background, in our history. But now we're entering this moment of kind of global competition, and those pressures are bringing out strategic diplomacy again in a way that I think we see in U.S. policy right now.
We're definitely going to come to the Trump administration in pretty short order here, but I want to return to the idea of values that you're talking about. I mean, it has been for, as you said, especially in the post-Cold War era, kind of a tenet of our foreign policy that we are kind of pursuing and our ideals, and that those kind of ideas and values play a central role in many of our alliances. And for a long time, there was a belief that then strengthened those alliances, that they weren't based on transactional back and forth, that there was something deeper and more binding about those relationships that gave our system of alliances more strength, resilience, robustness than, for example, the partnerships that we now see between Russia, China, Iran, North Korea. So is it your sense, though, that we need to rethink that somehow these kind of values and ideals are a weakness and hindering the use of effective diplomacy?
Well, one thing that became clear to me when writing the book is that all great powers, all the way back to antiquity, are invariably animated by a sense of national mission or purpose. In the book, I call it mission because that's the best word I could come up with. Something that is not just stark realpolitik or Machtpolitik, but is rather the identity of that great power, something that it cares about, that is of a religious or civic nature, that is its highest aspiration. And for the Byzantines, this was the universal church. The Habsburgs had a sense of civilizing mission as a Catholic power. The Venetians as a commercial republic, etc. And the U.S. is no exception in that sense. Although our size and scale and our experience in the 20th century maybe suggested way further horizons to what could be accomplished in that sense of national mission. But I would distinguish between that and maybe what you're asking about when it comes to values as that term has been used in the last many years. I think it's so nebulous as to almost be meaningless. And what I mean by that is that values mean different things to different people, even inside the United States. So a lot of the things that have been an animating purpose of our foreign policy over the last decade or two, a large portion of the American public might very much disagree with. Some of the things that the State Department promotes in policies today, a very healthy portion of the American public would disagree with. So if that is what is meant by values, then yes, I think those things in many cases have become deleterious or an impediment to the pursuit of the national interest. What I found over and over again in the book is that interests do invariably trump ideology. So any great power has a sense of mission. In moments of great danger, self interest, survive the quest to survive always trumps the sense of mission. But, and this is really important, that doesn't mean that the great power in question abandons its mission. I mean, the United States in World War II made an alliance with the world's greatest totalitarian ruler, Stalin. That when the war ended, we were still the United States. There were still core principles of our functioning as a republic, as a democratic republic. That's who we are. Mission is identity. But I think the danger came about after the Cold War. We almost started to levitate and see these things as trumping everything else. It, transcended national interest. It was more important than considerations of survival. When your pursuit of values depart from what your own populace believes in, or if they lead you down paths that are damaging to your self-interest, or even lead you into predicaments that you can't sustain, or that present a danger to the polity, it's both right and good and necessary that you reevaluate what is meant by the term values. And I think that's what's going on.
I mean, it's really, I'm teaching a class up at Yale, a grand strategy class, and the students have a remit, to come up with the next kind of national security strategy. And it's really interesting to watch them grapple with the role that kind of values, democracy, human rights should play in a future national security strategy. I mean, I agree with you that it really is being debated in a far different way than it was, say, maybe 10 years ago. But I was going to ask, I mean, so we had this kind of unipolar moment. And so, there was perhaps this long period of time where the United States didn't necessarily have to rely on diplomacy. You'll hear from our allies sometimes frustrations. There wasn't a lot of consultation. It was oftentimes that we were just informing allies, after the fact. It wasn't something that we were doing well. But my sense is that there has been a growing recognition in Washington, and maybe even during the Biden administration, that kind of the diplomacy piece was emaciated. And you had concepts with the Biden administration like integrated deterrence, for example, where there was a recognition that we rely too much on raw military power, that we want to integrate capabilities across domains, but we also wanted to leverage diplomatic, economic, informational tools in our strategy. That was a major driving concept at the Pentagon. Certainly with Secretary Blinken, there was a lot of focus on rebuilding the State Department. So what do you think the Biden administration was on to anything? And what did they do wrong?
Let me start by saying one thing that came to mind as you were talking at the beginning, just there, that is a central theme of my book that I think is relevant to the question you're asking. And it is that the goal of diplomacy for any state is not order as an end in itself. And I think this ties both to your earlier question about values and the question just now about Biden. What I've seen in recent years is a kind of mantra about this thing called RBIO, the rules-based international order. You hear it so frequently. If you poke a little bit and you lift the hood and you try to understand what it is, it's actually a fairly nebulous thing, but it's become such a catchphrase that to read a lot of what's being written in major foreign policy publications, you would think that the end goal for the United States in the world is to make sure that this thing called order continues. That's not the case. The end goal of diplomacy is the survival and welfare and prosperity of the nation state. When that departs from the maintenance of order, in every instance, the role of diplomacy must be to prioritize the national interest. When I think about the Biden administration, I see it as having, I mean, this concept of integrated deterrence, despite considerable effort, I never really managed to figure out what it meant.
Yep,
Um,
that's true.
Yeah.
I mean, I think the diplomacy on the diplomacy side, I saw the Biden administration as wanting to treat the first Trump administration as an aberration and return to a kind of uh, perceived normal of the post Cold War era, where the United States would play the role of kind of organizing, Western nations in a kind of crusade against democracy. At least that's how the Biden administration came into office, with this notion of the community of democracies, and it divided countries in the world into these categories. And then when crises would break out, it would frame things, it would frame the US objective in the widest universalist objectives possible. So, the case of Ukraine, the Biden administration uh, depicted this as a struggle of like democracy versus autocracy, and everything like democracy and motherhood and apple pie and everything was at stake. And then, of course, inevitably, there's going to be a mismatch between these massive, again, very nebulous but high sounding goals and the actual resources of what the United States and its allies can deliver. Because the simple fact of the matter is, right now, as two national defense strategies have made clear, we are not militarily set up to fight Russia and China simultaneously. We were doing good to even, supply a trickle of weapons to the Ukrainians. And even that depleted a lot of our critical stocks for contingencies in the Indo-Pacific. So when there's this wide of a mismatch between where you're at militarily, what your real resources are, and I would add to that what the public is willing to do. I mean, after the forever wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, the public mood is not, bear any burden, but I think the cardinal sin of the Biden administration, and a lot followed from this, was its framing of these almost messianic goals, and then a huge gap between that and what we could actually deliver. And I think that does not strengthen deterrence. I think it, undermines cohesion of alliances. And finally, I think the Biden administration made the mistake of putting too much emphasis on a kind of optical cohesion with allies. So like this easy spirit of bonhomie. It's like, Biden has this good relationship with mostly liberal minded European leaders, and that simply returning to an old rhetoric, again, treating the first Trump administration as an aberration, that somehow this was the work of diplomacy, to not push the allies on spending more, but on defense, but rather to show up at G7 and you're chumming it up with Trudeau and Schultz. Well, diplomacy is something more than just sweet reasonableness, and so those would be my starting point in critiquing that administration's diplomacy.
Thanks. I appreciate a lot of what you said. Andrea and I've talked about this too in terms of our views of the Biden administration and things that happened in the past, and that's kind of what I want to return to. Not necessarily just the Biden administration, but you were talking about how the end of the Cold War, and this beginning to erode away of the art of diplomacy, and instead looking at the military hammer as being the answer to some of these problems. So my question for you is an easy one. Tell me what crisis after the Cold War ended. What crisis do you think really lent itself to the diplomacy you're talking about, and that we missed an opportunity to go the diplomatic route, and instead we went too quickly to the military hammer, and in the early days we would have been more successful had we given the diplomacy, the type of diplomacy you're talking about, a chance. So if is there a particular crisis? And then the second part of that is, where's one where actually we did that? And not just the U.S., but we did turn to diplomacy first, and it worked, and we were able to avoid the military hammer being used. That in fact, there was a great example of of what you're talking about actually working. And again, this is post Cold War. Two examples that would help illustrate your point.
So first of all, I um, I agree on the premise there. The end of the Cold War, the erosion of diplomacy, and the temptation of the military, as you've put it, hammer. I would just add a detail, and this really comes across in my book, that this set of realities, the structural realities of unipolarity, I think are reflected in the mindset towards diplomacy of both left and right. So it's really from the early 90s onward that foreign policy in progressive circles in the United States does become much more about, the pursuit of multilateralism, the building up of international institutions, almost peace as an administrative science. But there's a corollary to that on the right among the neoconservatives, who really saw diplomacy as a form of surrender. That Munich was lurking behind every tree, and at most maybe the diplomacy was a kind of bag carrier or factotum to the military arm. Like, we're cleaning up after our wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and you need certain administrative functions to be fulfilled. But the answer to your question, what crisis would I point to after the Cold War where, high diplomacy was needed and not utilized? I would actually argue that the structural conditions after the Cold War, in some ways, it was inevitable that the United States would gravitate more towards the military tool and economic sanctions. I'm not saying that it was always wise to do so, but I think we were habituated to an environment without a peer competitor. And to me, classical diplomacy, as I said a moment ago, it is necessitated by and really comes into its own in competitive environments. And the competitive principle was missing in any really obvious way for most of the post-Cold War period. And that's why I think you only see really within the last few years, as the underlying balance of power has begun to shift. China is becoming stronger, has the largest military buildup in human history. The Russians are, again, militarily expansionist. It's only recently that you've really seen the U.S. start to move towards strategic diplomacy. I think that the second Trump administration is operating on the historical mold in that light. Its behavior, its choices, and we can get more into this, look a lot to me like the kinds of choices strategically that earlier great powers have made when they have faced a multi-front dilemma with multiple peers. But the point I would emphasize is that after the Cold War, we were in this kind of Goldilocks moment. And I think that created a temptation to pursue a transformationalist foreign policy. I'm not saying that was the right choice, but I think under the circumstances, it was probably the inevitable outcome on both left and right, given what was perceived to be this plastic moment where we thought, oh, gee, we can reshape even China and Russia into liberal. They're eventually going to become economically liberal and then politically liberal. So I think that underlying premise, if anything, the problem was we didn't question that premise sooner. In response, a reading of the tea leaves to begin to see that this establishment approach to world affairs was based on some premises that were not valid.
I'm going to pick up on the Trump piece now, because I also read you have a great piece in Foreign Affairs from earlier this year, back in the spring. And so this, certainly predates a lot of the things that have happened since. But you just made the point that, Trump is perhaps a great diplomat, or, returning to this diplomatic tradition. So I want to come to this foreign affairs piece, because you open with talking about how the Trump administration is pursuing these bold diplomatic initiatives that are needed. And you talk about the fact that they've opened talks with Putin over Ukraine, that we're communicating with Chinese leader Xi Jinping. And you note at the time, again, back in April, that Trump has sent the letter to the Iranian Supreme Leader Khamenei about bringing the country's nuclear program to an end. Well, then you fast forward to today, and I guess I would argue now that not only do we not have any progress on bringing an end to the war in Ukraine, but Putin is actually escalating. And even if you just, we could talk about the Polish drone incident, but even if you just look inside Ukraine, the number of missiles that are being launched at Ukraine on a monthly basis has skyrocketed since President Trump has come into office. We bombed Iran, and now we're, making arguably all sorts of concessions with the NVIDIA chips and other things to try to get to a trade deal and a summit with Xi. So is this diplomacy at work? Is it working? Is this tracked effective?
This is what I would say. I think we are witnessing a reinvigoration of diplomacy as an instrument of U.S. foreign policy. We have had in the last 7-8 months more large and, in my view, successful or certainly headed in the right direction diplomatic initiatives than in probably the previous, I don't know, more than a decade. I mean, there are, as you've said, there are significant efforts underway on Ukraine, in Gaza, with China. I would add to that the Trump team has diffused a number of significant regional crises. So Cambodia, Thailand, India, Pakistan, Rwanda, DRC. I think they're also building on the successful legacy of the Abraham Accords in the first term. And I think that a kind of style of diplomacy is emerging in the second Trump administration, which is negotiations backed by leverage, force, an understanding of negotiations, maybe instinctively from more of an American business perspective. I think so. That's the first comment. The second is that I think our strategic circumstances warrant this. So the use of diplomacy as an instrument of strategy because of the multi-front dilemma that we face. That doesn't mean that in the first 8 months, the administration is going to have overwhelming success in every initiative that it undertakes. But I think the logic, the impulse is correct. Given our strategic predicament, the reality is we do need to alleviate competition, I would argue, in at least 2 of the 3 major theaters. We can debate which ones those should be, but I would say Europe and the Middle East. It would benefit the United States to have less strategic exertion in those places militarily so that we can focus more on China. So I think we have to view the individual initiatives that the administration has taken diplomatically within that context. And I think it would be unreasonable to set the bar of, the necessity for strategic diplomacy as being whether each of those initiatives has succeeded yet. In the case of Russia, which I think is the most important, certainly the most visible of the initiatives that you've talked about. What I see that I think is missed by a lot of the commentariat on Trump's interactions with Putin is that, and that is consistent with the historic logic of diplomacy, is that it is, in my view, part of a wider strategy of using diplomacy to tighten constraints on Russia. So the tool of diplomacy vis-a-vis Russia doesn't just boil down to the president's meeting with Putin at Anchorage and what happens in the 30 to 60 days that follow. I think you have to back up and look at how the Trump team is using diplomacy to place constraints on an opponent. In my book, I really underscore over and over again in history, the logic of diplomacy has been about placing constraints on an opponent to prevent it from doing the things that it would want to do.
But Wes, what constraints have we placed on Russia under Trump?
Sure. Well, let me give you some examples. Starting in the spring, U.S. diplomacy with the Arab states on affecting global oil prices, which puts pressure on the Russian revenue, and those efforts are continue to be underway. Diplomacy with Europeans to get defense spending up. I mean, the historic commitment of Europeans to spend more on defense at the last NATO leaders meeting fits within this logic of constraints on Russia. Diplomacy with Armenia, Azerbaijan to increase pressure on Russia in Central Asia. Diplomacy with China to threaten Russia's line of supply to its main sponsor. The preparation of potential sanctions packages, including closing loopholes on the Biden-era sanction regime on energy-related banking sanctions. I would include in this category too the recent statements by President Trump put pressure on Europeans to cease oil purchases. To me, all of this fits within a logic of using diplomacy, again, not just with your interlock, not just with your opponent, but with your allies, with other factors in the international system, to create greater constraints on the preferred field of maneuver for your opponent. Is that going to bear fruit 8 months into the administration? 9 months into the administration? Maybe not. Will it bear fruit over the balance of the next 3.5 years? I think it will. I think by engaging with Putin, Trump has already begun to create the contours of a move towards a diplomatic settlement in Ukraine. It may very well be that additional U.S. pressure is needed, either in the form of sanctions, military support for the Ukrainians. But the point is that all of this fits within a logic of trying to bring the conflict in Ukraine to a diplomatic resolution where, there's not going to be a party in this that gets everything that they want. It's going to be a compromise solution. It may not even be a real resolution of the problem. It may be a Korea type situation where we have an armistice and then a parallel kind of process long term to figure out a broader peace that never really materializes. But the point strategically from the US perspective is using these various factors to eventually park that crisis and free up bandwidth for us to be able to focus on the primary opponent, which is China. So yeah, I see that logic of strategic diplomacy operating.
I think one of the big criticisms, though, is that this administration hasn't brought to bear many of the tools that it could to pressure Russia to get to do more of the constraint, to really up the costs on Putin, and that you acknowledge that perhaps more pressure will be needed. And so I guess my question is, why don't you think this administration has been willing to do that thus far? I mean, why don't we send more, weapons to Ukraine, or why don't we increase sanctions along the Lindsey Graham bill? There's a lot of other things I think that the president could bring to bear. I mean, why is it that we were willing to cave so quickly on this demand for a ceasefire first? I mean, there's been a lot of instances where I think more pressure could have been brought to bear, but we haven't yet seen it. And so 2 questions is, why do you think that's the case so far? And second question is, do you think this administration could get there?
Well, I think greater pressure on Russia may yet come, and it may be worthwhile at the right moment. I think that's a prudential judgment. And my sense is that the Trump administration is clearly signaling externally, both to allies and to the Russians, that we may get to that point. I mean, I think.
But the other thing that was thinking of is also all of these. I mean, part of good diplomacy, I would think it would be some kind of consistency, some credibility to the statements that you make. And we've had 7 of these so-called deadlines that the Russians have blown through with little cost. So is that good diplomacy in this case?
Well, I don't see what this alternative that you're alluding to, which is my view of how the Biden administration was proceeding, what it got us in the past. So if you agree to the premise that I've stated, that our goal should be to bring this conflict to enough of a resolution that we can focus more on the primary theater, you have to accept that there will eventually be a diplomatic outcome. How was the previous method, which you're articulating now as the alternative to what Trump is doing, it didn't bring us any closer to a diplomatic resolution to the conflict. My view is that Trump used pressure effectively to bring Putin to the table at Anchorage on a much faster timeline than Putin would have liked. But I think the president is striking a balance. And that's a balance between preparing leverage on one hand, which a good negotiator, I think, should do. And on the other hand, taking steps, not taking steps that would explode the whole process. I think that the administration is right to weigh this carefully. We're in a proxy war with a nuclear power. In the Cold War, that situation was always handled with the understanding that if your proxy can strike into the home territory of your rival, things can escalate quickly, and that the pressure you bring to bear is you graduate it in a careful way. I mean, think of the Cuban Missile Crisis. I think it's true in this case as well. And I think the president is right to put pressure on European allies. This is a corollary line of diplomacy that may make Europeans uncomfortable. But again, the goal is to increase the constraints on the Russians. If the Europeans are buying more oil, or they're spending more on Russian oil every year than they are giving to the Ukrainians in aid, why would the United States pursue a unilateral pressure approach that perhaps only gets us further away from eventual diplomatic talks? That would make no sense to me. But my sense is that probably the Russians will continue to see how much territory they can get during the warm months in the lead up to the fall when the rains come. This is the typical cycle of the Ukraine war. And that any willingness to really get serious about diplomacy won't come until once we've gotten into the fall and the Russians are forced to kind of reassess where things stand. So I don't think that the book is closed yet, either with respect to Zelensky and Putin talking, or with respect to the Trump administration using pressure. But I think that's a prudential question, and that our allies have to be part of the equation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you're right that Russia's not going to stop until it, sees that the costs are so high that they either on the battlefield, or that the costs are so high that Putin judges he can't go on indefinitely. And so, Ukrainians are taking out Russian oil facilities. But I do think that there's a lot this administration could do to bring that about more quickly. And I hope that they eventually get there. But I know Jim wants to ask a question.
Well, thanks, Andrea. Very interesting discussion there, and that I know a lot of people are asking. And Wes, I think you presented a very good case in answering Andrea's questions. And so this is just that conversation between the two of you, I think, very, very fruitful. Let me ask you, I know we're running out of time, so this is my last question, Andrea. So you can.
They're a big one, so we're not going anywhere quite yet, because this is great, Wes. I really appreciate it. Yeah,
it is. So Wes, if you could put your Assistant Secretary of State hat back on from the first Trump term, and based on what you all were just talking about in terms of how the situation is today in Europe among the allies, between the allies and the United States, dealing with Russia, Ukraine, what do you think the next 5 to 10 years might look like in terms of the U.S.-European relationship and NATO and that type of thing? The days that we all grew up in terms of the transatlantic relationship and the U.S. role at NATO and in Europe, I think we can safely say that those days are behind us. We don't know what the next number of years are going to look like. It's going to be different. What do you think it might look like? Just the transatlantic relationship, defense relationship, NATO, NATO EU, among the European nations themselves. What does that look like to you?
Well, that's a great question. My view has always been that the Trump administration, this was true in the first term, and I think it's certainly true in the second term, is pursuing a renovationist approach to our alliances. And I think Europe is exhibit A. And what I mean by renovationist is that the goal is not to destroy or undermine or explode our alliances, but it is to renegotiate the basic terms of those alliances in a way that is more favorable or sustainable from a U.S. strategic perspective. That's necessary for the reasons we've just discussed, the multi-front dilemma. We haven't talked about the U.S. debt, but I mean the defense industrial base, et cetera, et cetera. I see that logic in both the administration's approach to the NATO leaders meeting in The Hague, as well as the Turnberry Agreement. I think if you view those collectively, those two things, those were remarkable accomplishments in my view in a very short period of time, moving towards this goal of a recalibrated alliance in which European allies are more capable and willing to handle more of the conventional deterrence burden, number one, in their own theater. And number two, they're more willing than they have been in the past to enter into a reciprocal trade arrangement with the United States. This is necessary in my view. It's also, there are also precedents to this. So President Reagan, with the Plaza Accords, renegotiating basic terms, primarily on currency, of our economic relationship with European allies as well as Japan. More notably, the Nixon administration, the Smithsonian Agreement, where then Treasury Secretary Connolly basically went to the Europeans and said, look, with the closing of the gold window, we're going to have to talk about the imbalance of imports and exports. So I think it's not unprecedented, but I think it's on a bigger scale. So where will it be in 5 to 10 years? I think where we're likely to be as a result of some of the foundations that have been laid both in trade and security is a relationship where you have a rebalancing of benefits and burdens in a way that frees up the US to focus more on the Indo-Pacific, but without losing us a role as a European power. That benefits the US in terms of advancing the goal of reindustrialization, which we need vis-a-vis China. It helps us by freeing up the conventional defense burden in Europe because we ain't moving back to a two-war standard, in my view, anytime soon. So I think that's where we're headed. The Europeans, they've gotten really ticked off at times at the Trump administration, but I think actually the balance sheet favors the Trump administration's approach in that these things are painful to the Europeans, but they're necessary and overdue. And the likelihood is that we will have a more fairly and sustainably balanced relationship as a result. That's my prediction.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big successes of the Trump administration is the rebalancing of that relationship, because I definitely agree with your premise, Wes, that given the shifts in geopolitics, the convergence and the cooperation amongst adversaries, that Europe just simply has to take on a bigger role. And that was one of the questions I want to ask you, though, is then where do you think the U.S. is headed with this next defense posture? I mean, I think we all understand that, yes, Europe does need to play a far greater role in providing for its own conventional defense, but it takes time. And so is there a recognition in this administration, do you think, that we need to have a incremental, phased, and highly choreographed handoff of those responsibilities? Or do you think they just want to say, hey, we're not doing this anymore. It needs to rebalance. It needs to rebalance now. We're out of here. Over to you to try to fill these gaps as best and as quickly as you can.
Well, that's a good question. And my starting observation would be that the last two national defense strategies so the first one under President Trump and then the one under Biden, both had this gap between stated objectives, so rhetorical objectives about prioritizing the main threat. So, both of them said, look, we don't have a military that's set up to fight all of our opponents simultaneously. China is the pacing threat, which is correct. And then there was a gap between that and our actual material dispositions, our posture, what we treated as our priorities. And that gap was especially wide under the Biden administration, given the focus on the war in Ukraine. My suspicion is that the next national defense strategy and associated documents, the NSS, the posture review, et cetera, will make headway in closing that gap. So I suspect that there will be a justifiable increased focus on the Western Hemisphere along the logic that any great power is only as strong externally as its ability to be stable and prosperous and secure in its own hemisphere. So I expect that'll be an important ingredient. But that then when we look at the wider world, I assume China will continue to be the pacing threat, like underscored in red, that I assume U.S. Posture and decisions about how we're, equipping our forces will follow from that logic. And these things don't happen overnight, but I imagine that over the next 3.5 years, the Trump administration will move in the direction of closing that gap. That will mean that the U.S. is probably less present in Europe than it was in the past. I doubt that means that the United States will cease to be, onshore player in Europe in certain regards, but it won't look like what it's looked like, in the Cold War or the post-Cold War period. And similarly in the Middle East, I think it's just in the cards that eventually the U.S. is moving towards a reality where we're making greater use of onshore allies. We're not completely gone from the region, but where there's, less ambiguity about the military focus on China. My former colleague, Bridge Colby, I think has done a very good job of underscoring China as the pacing threat. My sense is that the United States is at this moment where there are other things, Ukraine, the situation in Iran, that are vexing and that are calling for our attention, but that there is a growing consensus that the United States has to be able to match resources to the top problem. I think that's just in the cards for us over time. It's a question of how we manage the tactics of getting there, but I suspect that's where we're moving.
Yeah, I fully agree with the prioritization. I mean, that's absolutely right. But just as important as prioritization, I think, is also the sequencing. And I think what I fear, and many of our European allies fear, is that too quick and sudden of a transition actually creates vulnerabilities that precipitate new problems that would then make prioritization hard. But you've been very patient and generous with your time. One last question, which is kind of on this axis of upheaval. I mean, obviously something that we've been thinking a lot about, the growing coordination between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. In your foreign affairs article, you kind of talk about, the reverse Kissinger in today's world, it's Russia that is the kind of weaker partner. I mean, what do you think? Well, how do you think this administration is thinking about the growing coordination between those four actors, Russia, China, Iran, North Korea? And do you think that they are pursuing that kind of reverse Kissinger thing? Is the strategy that they want to, quote unquote, peel Russia away? Is that advisable? Can it be successful? What would you recommend? And, I guess the question is, how would you bring diplomacy, as you describe it, to bear to address this axis of upheaval?
Well, it's a good question. My starting point is just that the hour is very late, and that the blocks are hardening. That's obvious. I mean, the degree of coordination between the Russians and the Chinese and the North Koreans is greater now than it was a few years ago, even if they're not, well, with the exception of Russia and North Korea, even though they're not in a formal military alliance, it sure looks like that from the outside in many ways. But having said that, I think it's in our interest to continue to try to find where the fissures are, try to create daylight, even when the gains are at the margins. They may not be insignificant. And I think we should premise our approach on the idea that dependency in geopolitics always chafes. It always creates abrasions. So Russia, on its current path, as a result of the Ukraine war and its isolation economically, is just more and more of a dependency on China. I doubt that the Russians long-term want to be a sidecar to China, but that's where they're moving. I doubt that the Chinese want Russia in every instance to be, kind of nailed to their flagpole when the Russians are behaving in an aggressive and unpredictable way. So I keep in mind that Russia and China are coordinating tightly, but their interests are not identical. And I think we may see some triangulation in the days ahead, given that the Trump administration, I think correctly, has pursued in parallel bilateral engagement with the Russians on Ukraine-related, strategic-related things, maybe eventually some arms control-related things, and in parallel is pursuing trade talks with the Chinese. I think this creates space for some triangulation in the sense of conditionality. So, for example, it's not hard to imagine the United States vis-a-vis China saying, look, in order for us to finalize this trade deal, we need you to do the following things, X, Y, and Z, as they relate to purchasing Russian oil or supplying the Russians with chips, or, it's not hard to see how some triangulation could be brought about. I think that the moves by the administration diplomatically in Central Asia, so its involvement in the historic Azerbaijan-Armenia deal, is a great way to wrong foot the Russians in their own neighborhood and remind them that the longer they're tied up in Ukraine, the less influence they'll have in some of their traditional stomping grounds. I view it in a similar way in the Far East. I mean, the Russian Far East, we may see, Japanese Prime Minister Abe's idea years ago may eventually resurface, that as things eventually move towards a diplomatic resolution in Ukraine, U.S. allies and partners in East Asia may be in a position to provide alternatives to Chinese investment in the Russian Far East. Whatever form it takes, I think there are a number of avenues that the US can explore, and it looks like we are exploring, that just shine a light on the fact that our adversaries are not, again, their interests are not identical. Their timelines are not aligned. Like, Putin moved on a clock in Ukraine that was way ahead of where Xi is at on Taiwan. So it may be that it is too late and that their block is hardened to a point that you can't splinter it. But I think it's in our interest to try, and there may be gains that can be had even at the margins.
Yeah. I mean, I definitely acknowledge, not aligned on every issue or in every region. We should try to exploit fissures. I think what I found is sometimes, though, it's difficult to find those fissures that we actually have leverage over. But I think you've mentioned a few. And I think that just the last thing I'll say, the worry is that there is this pursuit of trying to peel Russia away, where we're making concessions to Russia to try to normalize that relationship, to try to reduce the factors that, are encouraging them to pursue deeper relations with China. But that in doing so, giving certain things away, you actually strengthen the position from which they can confront the US in the future. So it will require very astute diplomacy along the lines that you've suggested, I think, to deal with this threat. And I think on that note, just echoing, for our Brussels Sprouts listeners, what a fantastic read the book is. Just to say it again, it's Great Power Diplomacy, The Skill of Statecraft from Attila the Hun to Kissinger. Everyone should go and read it. I hope this discussion should have significantly whetted the appetite, I think, for what is an excellent read. So Wes, thank you so much for joining us, and huge congratulations on the book.
Yeah, Wes, thank you. It's great to see you. And I really appreciate a lot of what you said about what's happening today, and also the historic aspects. I can't wait to read the book. It'll be good.
Well, Andrea and Jim, thank you for your hospitality. You've been very generous with your time, and I appreciated to have the opportunity to talk to you about the book. Thank you.
All right, everyone go buy it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Brussels Sprouts, brought to you by the Transatlantic Security Team at the Center for a New American Security. You can find all of our previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts. And please remember to rate and review Brussels Sprouts so that new listeners are able to find the show.